The room smells of stale cigarette smoke and disbelief. It's November 1944, somewhere in England, in a temporary structure that serves as an Allied intelligence facility. A German Luftwaffe officer sits across from his American interrogator. The officer is a logistics coordinator, captured 3 weeks earlier over the Ruhr Valley. His uniform is clean but worn. His eyes are tired. The American slides a folder across the table. Inside are production figures, numbers, columns of data that track the output of a single factory in Michigan. The German scans the page. His finger stops at one line. He looks up, shakes his head, and pushes the folder back. "This is propaganda," he says quietly in accented English. "No one builds a heavy bomber in 1 hour." The interrogator doesn't argue. He simply opens another folder. This one contains reconnaissance photographs. Rows of silver aircraft, hundreds of them, parked wing to wing on airfields across East Anglia, all identical, all built in the same place. The German stares at the images for a long time. The numbers say that Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan is completing one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. The photographs confirm what the numbers claim. And in that silent moment, sitting in a cold room across the channel from his homeland, the officer begins to understand something his commanders refused to believe: that Germany had already lost the war, not on the battlefield but in the factories of Detroit. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the United States Army Air Corps possessed fewer than 2,000 aircraft. Most were obsolete. Many still had fabric-covered wings. The idea that America could become the world's dominant air power seemed laughable to military planners in Berlin, Tokyo, and even London. Germany, by contrast, had spent 6 years preparing for total war. Since 1933, when Hitler came to power, the Reich had secretly rebuilt its air force in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. By September 1939, the Luftwaffe fielded over 4,000 modern combat aircraft. German factories hummed with purpose. Messerschmitt, Junkers, Heinkel, and Focke-Wulf plants operated around the clock. The Germans had refined their production techniques through years of experience. They knew how to build warplanes efficiently. They believed their industrial capacity was untouchable. American aviation in the 1930s was a boutique industry. Companies like Boeing, Douglas, and Consolidated Aircraft built planes almost by hand. Skilled craftsmen assembled each aircraft individually. Tolerances varied. Parts from one plane rarely fit another. A bomber might take months to complete. Production numbers were measured in dozens per year, not hundreds. The B-24 Liberator was born from this artisan tradition. Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego designed it in 1939 as a long-range heavy bomber to complement Boeing's B-17 Flying Fortress. The B-24 featured a revolutionary Davis wing, high aspect ratio, incredibly efficient at altitude. It could fly farther and carry more bombs than almost anything else in the sky, but it was also complicated. The aircraft contained over 450,000 individual parts. More than 1.2 million rivets held it together. The fuselage, wings, tail, engines, gun turrets, bomb bay, and landing gear all required precision engineering. Early production crawled. Consolidated San Diego plant completed its first B-24 in December 1939. By the end of 1940, the company had delivered only 37 aircraft. Each plane required approximately 160,000 man-hours to build. Skilled aviation workers installed systems by hand. Inspectors checked every rivet. The bottleneck was obvious. America could never build enough bombers this way to make a difference in a global war. Then in the spring of 1940, France fell. Britain stood alone. Winston Churchill sent urgent cables to President Roosevelt, begging for aircraft, weapons, anything that could keep the island nation alive. Roosevelt understood what Churchill knew, that defeating Germany would require drowning the Reich in materiel. The Nazis would have to be outproduced, outgunned, and overwhelmed by sheer industrial volume. The president called it the arsenal of democracy. America would become the factory that supplied freedom. But there was a problem. The aviation industry, even working at full capacity, couldn't meet the demand. Britain alone needed thousands of aircraft. If America entered the war, the numbers would multiply exponentially. Traditional aircraft manufacturing methods couldn't scale fast enough. Someone suggested the impossible. What if automobile manufacturers built airplanes? What if the mass production techniques that created 15 million Model T Fords could be applied to heavy bombers? What if instead of craftsmen you used assembly lines? Aviation experts dismissed the idea immediately. Aircraft weren't cars. They required precision, skilled labor, engineering expertise. You couldn't just stamp out bombers like fenders. The tolerances were too tight. The systems too complex. The risks too high, but one man listened. His name was Henry Ford, and he'd built an empire by proving experts wrong. Henry Ford was 77 years old in 1940. His company had transformed America once already by making the automobile affordable to ordinary people. The assembly line he pioneered at Highland Park in 1913 revolutionized manufacturing. Before Ford, cars were expensive luxuries built one at a time. After Ford, they became transportation for the masses. He understood something fundamental about production that others didn't. Break a complex product into simple, repeatable tasks and almost anyone can build it. The government approached Ford in early 1941 with a question. Could his company build aircraft engines under license? Ford said yes, but suggested something bolder. Why not build entire airplanes? Not fighters or small planes, but the biggest, most complex bomber in the American arsenal, the B-24 Liberator. Military officials were skeptical. Ford engineers visited Consolidated Aircraft's San Diego facility to study the B-24. What they saw confirmed their suspicions. The aircraft was built using traditional methods, skilled workers moving from station to station, parts fitted individually, each plane slightly different from the last. It was craftsmanship, not manufacturing. Ford's engineers reported back that the current process was impossibly inefficient. But they also said something else. The B-24 could be redesigned for mass production. It would require standardization, new tooling, and a facility unlike anything that existed, but it could be done. Ford proposed building a factory dedicated solely to B-24 production, not a modest plant that made a few dozen bombers per month, but an industrial cathedral capable of completing one finished aircraft every single hour. The government, desperate for production capacity, gave him a contract. In January 1941, construction began on what would become the largest room under one roof in the world, the Willow Run bomber plant. The facility rose from farmland 25 miles west of Detroit. The main assembly building stretched more than a mile long and a quarter-mile wide. It covered 3.5 million square feet. The scale was incomprehensible. You could fit the Pentagon inside it. 42,000 workers would eventually labor there in 3 shifts around the clock. Railroad tracks ran directly into the building to deliver raw materials. Aluminum, steel, rubber, glass, and electrical components arrived in freight cars and emerged hours later as complete aircraft. But building the factory was the easy part. The real challenge was redesigning the B-24 itself. Consolidated's original design allowed for variation. Parts were hand-fitted during assembly. Tolerances were loose because skilled workers compensated. Ford's engineers eliminated all of that. They created detailed blueprints for every single component with exact specifications. They demanded interchangeable parts. A wing spar from Subassembly Station 7 had to fit perfectly with a fuselage section from Station 12. No hand-fitting allowed. They broke the bomber into 5 major subassemblies that could be built simultaneously, then joined together in final assembly. Aviation purists hated it. They argued that aircraft required the human touch, that mass production would compromise quality, that Ford was turning a precision instrument into a consumer product. Charles Lindbergh visited Willow Run and expressed doubts. Consolidated's engineers warned that Ford's approach was reckless. Even some military officials worried that the planes rolling off Ford's line would be structurally unsound or unsafe. Ford ignored them. He hired workers with no aviation experience. Many were women who'd never held an industrial job before. He trained them for specific, repetitive tasks. One person installed a particular type of rivet in a specific location, nothing more. He designed custom tools and jigs that made precise work possible even for novices. He created an assembly line where partially completed bombers moved continuously through the plant, with workers adding components at each station. The first B-24 rolled out of Willow Run in September 1942. It had taken 18 months longer than Ford originally promised. The plant struggled initially. Turnover was high. Parts didn't fit. Assemblies arrived out of sequence. Production rates were dismal. Only 1 bomber completed in September, 7 in October. Critics called the facility Willow Run instead of Willow Run. It seemed the skeptics had been right. You couldn't mass-produce a heavy bomber. The project looked like an expensive failure. But Ford's engineers kept refining the process. They identified bottlenecks. They improved tooling. They adjusted training. They smoothed the flow of materials. Slowly, production accelerated. By the end of 1942, Willow Run was completing 56 bombers per month. In early 1943, that number doubled. By summer, it doubled again. The assembly line began to work exactly as Ford had envisioned. And in Germany, intelligence analysts noticed the numbers but refused to believe them. Angle 1. The human element rose will. Monroe was 23 years old when she arrived at Willow Run in 1943. She'd driven from Kentucky with 2 young daughters in the back seat, fleeing an abusive marriage and looking for work that paid enough to survive. She had no mechanical experience. She'd never been inside a factory. But Willow Run was hiring anyone willing to learn, and the pay was 85 cents an hour, more money than Rose had ever imagined earning. They put her on the riveting line. Her job was simple in concept, brutal in execution. She operated a pneumatic rivet gun, fastening aluminum sheets to the B-24's internal frame structure. 8 hours a day, sometimes 10, she squeezed the trigger and drove rivets home. Her arms ached. Her ears rang despite the cotton wadding she stuffed in them. The noise inside the plant was constant. Metal on metal, compressed air hissing, hundreds of rivet guns firing simultaneously. But Rose was good at it. Fast, accurate, efficient. She worked on the bomber's wing sections and her rivets never leaked or loosened. A photographer spotted her one day and asked to take her picture for a war bond campaign. That photograph made her the face of Rosie the Riveter, the cultural icon representing millions of American women who entered industrial work during the war. But Rose didn't care about symbolism. She cared about the paycheck that fed her daughters and the knowledge that every rivet she drove helped build something that might end the war faster. She was one of approximately 42,000 workers at Willow Run during peak production. Women made up nearly 40% of the workforce. Many had never held jobs outside the home. They learned to operate drill presses, install electrical systems, apply sealant to fuel tanks, and assemble hydraulic mechanisms. The training programs ran constantly. 10 days to learn a specific task, then straight to the line. Some tasks required more time. Welders needed 3 weeks. Electricians needed a month. But Ford's system was designed so that most jobs could be learned quickly by anyone with functional hands and a willingness to work. The diversity of the workforce was unprecedented. Black workers from the South arrived in Detroit by the thousands, escaping Jim Crow and seeking industrial wages. Mexican Americans came from the Southwest. Appalachian whites drove north from Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia. They worked side by side on the assembly line, though segregation still existed in the plant's cafeterias and certain facilities. The war effort demanded their labor but didn't erase America's racial divisions. Turnover remained a constant problem. Workers quit because the job was too hard. They quit because childcare fell through. They quit because they got better offers elsewhere, or because their husbands returned from military service and demanded they come home. Ford's personnel department hired hundreds of new workers every week just to maintain staffing levels. Yet somehow the line kept moving. Somehow, the bombers kept rolling out the doors. Angle 2. The engineering puzzle, the B-24 Liberator weighed 36,500 pounds empty and up to 65,000 pounds fully loaded. It had a wingspan of 110 feet and measured 67 feet from nose to tail. Inside that airframe were 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, 10 50 caliber machine guns, a bomb bay capable of carrying 8,000 pounds of ordnance, oxygen systems for high-altitude flight, electrical systems, hydraulic systems, fuel systems, all redundant and interconnected. Building it on an assembly line seemed impossible because aircraft assembly traditionally required accessing the structure from multiple angles simultaneously. Workers needed to climb inside the fuselage, reach into tight spaces, install components in specific sequences. Moving the entire aircraft down a production line while maintaining that kind of access violated everything aviation manufacturers knew. Ford's engineers solved it through modular construction. They divided the B-24 into 5 major sub-assemblies. the forward fuselage, the center fuselage, the rear fuselage, the wing section, and the tail assembly. Each subassembly was built on its own dedicated line with workers stationed around it in a fixed position. The structures moved slowly down their respective lines while teams installed systems. Only when each subassembly was nearly complete did they converge at final assembly. The wing section presented the greatest challenge. The B-24's Davis wing was structurally complex, thin, efficient, but requiring precise engineering. Ford broke it into left and right wing panels, each built as a complete unit including fuel tanks, control surfaces, engine mounts, and landing gear. The panels arrived at final assembly already painted, sealed, tested, and ready to bolt onto the center fuselage. This approach required manufacturing tolerances far tighter than traditional aircraft construction. Every hole drilled in a wing spar had to align perfectly with corresponding holes in the fuselage attachment points. No hand fitting, no adjustments. If the tolerances were off by even a few thousandths of an inch, the parts wouldn't mate correctly, and the entire assembly would halt. Ford invested heavily in custom tooling and jigs, massive metal fixtures that held components in exact positions during assembly. A single jig for the center fuselage section weighed 40 tons. These tools ensured repeatability. If Station 12 installed a bulkhead using the jig, that bulkhead would be in precisely the same position in every aircraft every time. Angle 3. The mathematics of speed 63 minutes. That was the interval between completed aircraft rolling off the final assembly line during peak production in 1944, not 63 minutes to build an entire bomber from raw materials. That process still took thousands of man-hours, spread across multiple shifts and assembly stages. But 63 minutes from one finished B-24 emerging from the plant to the next one following behind it. The mathematics were staggering. At that rate, Willow Run completed 381 bombers per month, more than 12 per day, one every hour plus 3 minutes. The plant operated 24 hours, so there was no downtime. Night shift workers picked up exactly where day shift left off. The assembly line never stopped moving. To sustain that pace, materials had to arrive in perfect synchronization. Aluminum sheet arrived in railroad cars, 3 freight cars per day at peak production. Steel tubing, rubber components, plexiglass for gun turrets, electrical wiring measured in miles per aircraft. The logistics were managed with the same precision Ford applied to parts manufacturing. Late deliveries meant line stoppages. Stoppages meant missed quotas. The entire operation was a tightly choreographed ballet of materials. Labor and time, Angle 4, the German perspective in Berlin, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the Reich Aviation Ministry, received intelligence reports throughout 1943 that made no sense. Allied bomber formations over Germany were growing larger. The numbers suggested American production was accelerating beyond anything German planners had projected. But the figures seemed physically impossible. Oberst Josef Schmid, chief of Luftwaffe intelligence, reviewed reconnaissance photographs of American airfields in England. He counted aircraft. He tracked serial numbers on downed bombers. His analysts compiled production estimates. The data indicated that American factories were completing approximately 2,000 heavy bombers per month by mid-1943. That number would climb to 2,500 by early 1944. Schmid's superiors rejected the analysis. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, called the figures American propaganda and Jewish mathematics. He insisted that no industrial system could produce heavy bombers at such rates. Germany's entire aviation industry, dozens of factories spread across the Reich and occupied territories, was completing roughly 2,000 aircraft per month total, including fighters, bombers, and transports. The idea that America alone was matching or exceeding that output seemed absurd. German aircraft production was decentralized and varied. Messerschmitt built Bf-109 fighters. Junkers produced Ju-88 bombers. Focke-Wulf manufactured FW-190s. Each company had its own methods, tooling, and supply chains. Standardization was limited. Parts from one manufacturer rarely fit another's aircraft. Quality remained high, but quantity suffered. A German factory might produce 30 to 50 aircraft per month. The concept of a single facility completing hundreds of identical bombers was outside their frame of reference. Captured Allied air crews were interrogated about American production. German intelligence officers asked about factory locations, output rates, and manufacturing methods. Some prisoners, either through genuine knowledge or successful disinformation, confirmed the numbers. They spoke of massive plants in Detroit, Seattle, and Southern California. They mentioned assembly lines and mass production techniques. But Luftwaffe leadership dismissed these accounts as either fabrications meant to damage German morale or exaggerations by poorly informed enlisted men. The cognitive dissonance persisted even as evidence mounted. By late 1943, German radar stations were tracking bomber streams of 500 to 700 aircraft attacking a single target. These formations represented more heavy bombers than Germany believed America could possibly field in total. Yet they appeared almost daily. The Americans were replacing losses faster than the Luftwaffe could inflict them. Statistically, the defenders were winning. German fighters shot down hundreds of Allied bombers. But the bombers kept coming in ever greater numbers. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, understood the implications before most of his colleagues. In a meeting with Göring in late 1943, he stated flatly that Germany was losing the production war. Galland had done the mathematics. Even if German fighters achieved a favorable kill ratio, shooting down 2 Allied bombers for every German fighter lost, it didn't matter if the Americans could replace those bombers overnight while Germany struggled to replace its fighters. Göring accused Galland of defeatism, but Galland was simply reading the numbers that others refused to see. Angle 5. Innovation through standardization. Ford's revolution at Willow Run wasn't about inventing new technologies. The B-24 already existed. The tools and techniques for building aircraft were well established. What Ford innovated was the systematic application of interchangeable parts and process standardization to a product previously thought too complex for such treatment. Every rivet hole was drilled in the same location on every aircraft. Every wire was cut to the same length. Every bolt torqued to the same specification. The blueprints didn't allow for variation or interpretation. They were absolute. A worker installing hydraulic lines in bomber number 1247 performed exactly the same motions, in the same sequence, as the worker who'd installed hydraulics in bomber number 1. This standardization enabled speed but also consistency. Early B-24s from Consolidated's San Diego plant had reputations for quirks. One aircraft's controls might feel slightly different from another's. Fuel consumption could vary. Performance characteristics differed subtly. Willow Run's B-24s were identical. A pilot could transition from one to another and find every switch, gauge, and control in precisely the same position. The flight characteristics were uniform. Maintenance crews loved them because parts genuinely were interchangeable. Quality control operated differently than in traditional aviation manufacturing. Instead of master craftsmen inspecting each aircraft at completion, Ford employed inspectors at every stage of assembly. Components were checked before installation. Sub-assemblies were tested before integration. By the time a bomber reached the end of the line, it had been inspected hundreds of times by dozens of different people. Defects were caught early when they were easy to fix, rather than after final assembly when repairs meant tearing apart completed work. The plant also implemented continuous improvement protocols. When workers identified inefficiencies or problems, engineers adjusted the process. Tool designs were refined. Station layouts were optimized. Training methods improved. The 63-minute production interval wasn't achieved overnight. It was the result of thousands of small improvements compounded over 2 years. Angle 6. The Arsenal Philosophy Willow Run represented something larger than aircraft production. It embodied American industrial capitalism's answer to totalitarian military power. The United States wasn't going to outfight Germany plane for plane or soldier for soldier. It was going to bury the Reich under an avalanche of material. Germany utilized slave labor extensively by 1943. Concentration camp prisoners, forced laborers from occupied territories, and prisoners of war were worked to death building weapons. The moral depravity was obvious, but the economic calculation seemed sound. Free labor reduced production costs. Yet Germany's production numbers remained relatively stagnant. Slave labor was inefficient. Sabotage was common. Workers had no incentive to maintain quality or speed. The system maximized cruelty but not output. Ford paid his workers well by 1940s standards. Those wages created a motivated workforce that had a stake in success. Workers could buy homes, support families, and build futures. The productivity gains from motivated, trained workers far exceeded what could be extracted through coercion. The B-24 production line became an economic argument. Free labor, properly organized and incentivized, outperformed slavery. Detroit's transformation was total. The city that put America on wheels now put it in the air. Packard built aircraft engines. Chrysler produced tanks. General Motors manufactured everything from aircraft components to artillery shells. The automotive industry's conversion to war production happened faster and more completely than anyone predicted. By 1944, civilian automobile production had ceased entirely. Every factory, every worker, every ounce of capacity was devoted to military output. This was the arsenal of democracy in physical form. Not a slogan, but a reality measured in tons of aluminum, miles of wiring, and rows of bombers stretching across airfields. The American economic model, mass production, consumer capitalism, industrial efficiency, proved to be a war-winning advantage as significant as any weapon system. And nowhere was that advantage more visible than in the impossible, undeniable fact that Ford was completing a heavy bomber faster than most factories could assemble a truck. August 1944. Willow Run reaches its absolute peak. The plant completes 432 B-24 Liberators in 31 days. That's an average of 13.9 aircraft per day. The math translates to one bomber every 103 minutes across the entire month. But on certain days, particularly mid-month when material supplies align perfectly and absenteeism is low, the interval drops even further. On August 17th, the plant hits its record. One finished B-24 rolls off the line every 63 minutes for 18 consecutive hours. The scene inside Willow Run at that moment is controlled chaos. The main assembly line stretches into the distance, disappearing into haze and artificial light. Partially completed fuselages move steadily along the track, each one a different stage of completion. At Station 47, workers install the bombardier's nose section with its plexiglass panels. At Station 62, electricians route control cables through the fuselage interior. At Station 79, mechanics bolt the massive wing assembly onto the center section, lining up hundreds of attachment points that must align perfectly. The noise is physical. Rivet guns chatter in overlapping rhythms. Compressed air hisses from pneumatic tools. Metal screeches against metal as components slide into position. Overhead cranes groan under the weight of engines being lowered onto wing mounts. Supervisors shout instructions over the din. The conveyor system rumbles continuously beneath everything. A deep mechanical heartbeat that never pauses. At the end of the line, a completed B-24 sits on its landing gear for the first time. It's been painted in olive drab and gray camouflage. The serial number is freshly stenciled on the tail. The national insignia, white star on blue circle, gleams on the fuselage sides. Test pilots perform final checks. They start the engines one at a time. Each Pratt & Whitney R-1830 coughs blue smoke before settling into a steady roar. The pilots run through the checklist, testing control surfaces, checking fuel flow, verifying electrical systems. Then they taxi the bomber out through the plant's massive doors into Michigan sunlight. The aircraft rolls across a short airstrip adjacent to the factory. The pilot advances the throttles. 4 engines thunder at full power. The B-24 accelerates, lifts off, and climbs into a cloudless sky. Total elapsed time from final assembly station to takeoff, 45 minutes. Behind it, already moving into position at the end of the line, is the next bomber. And the next, and the next. Across the Atlantic, this production miracle translates into overwhelming aerial presence. By August 1944, the 8th Air Force in England operates more than 2,000 heavy bombers. Missions involve 500 to 1,000 aircraft striking targets across occupied Europe and Germany. The bomber streams stretch for miles. German radar operators watch the formations build up over England and calculate the approximate number of aircraft. The figures they report seem impossible, yet the bombers arrive exactly as predicted. On August 24, 1944, a German logistics officer named Major Heinrich Müller is shot down over Belgium. His Me-262 jet fighter suffers engine failure during an intercept mission. He ejects and is captured by advancing American forces within hours. By August 26, he's in England, sitting across a desk from U.S. Army Air Force intelligence officers. Mueller is career military, professional, and pragmatic. He's not a fanatical Nazi, just a competent officer trying to survive the war. The interrogators treat him correctly. They offer cigarettes, coffee, and simple food. Then they begin asking questions, not about German defenses or secret weapons, but about his assessment of Allied air power. Mueller is forthright. He tells them the Luftwaffe is losing. Fuel shortages are critical. Pilot training is abbreviated. Losses are unsustainable. But he also says something else. He tells them that German leadership refuses to believe American production numbers. He explains that Luftwaffe intelligence reports are dismissed as Allied disinformation. The idea that the Americans are building heavy bombers at rates exceeding German total aircraft production is considered mathematically impossible. The interrogator slides a folder across the table. Inside are production statistics for Willow Run, month-by-month totals, charts showing the acceleration from 1942 through 1944, a detailed breakdown of Ford's assembly process, photographs of the facility's interior showing multiple bombers in various stages of completion simultaneously. Mueller reads carefully. He's a logistics officer. He understands production planning and industrial capacity. His finger moves down the columns of numbers. When he reaches the August 1944 projection, 432 aircraft, he stops. He reads it again. Then he looks up at his interrogator. "This is one factory?" he asks. "One factory," the interrogator confirms. Mueller sits back. He lights another cigarette. His hands are steady, but something in his expression changes. It's not shock exactly. It's recognition. The recognition that everything he'd been told about American industrial weakness was catastrophically wrong. That the war was already decided not by bravery or tactics or technology, but by production capacity so overwhelming it rendered German resistance meaningless. "Every 63 minutes?" he asks quietly. "On peak days, yes." Mueller is silent for a long moment. Then he says almost to himself, "We never had a chance." The interrogation room moment is intimate, personal. But the larger reality it represents is playing out across the skies of Europe on a scale that defies comprehension. On any given morning in late summer 1944, German radar stations along the occupied French coast begin detecting formations around 800 hours. The contacts appear first as scattered signals, then coalesce into massive groups. Controllers plot the tracks on maps using grease pencils. Each formation is assigned a number and estimated strength. By 900 hours, it's clear that 800 to 1,000 Allied bombers are assembling over England, preparing to cross the Channel. Luftwaffe fighter squadrons scramble. Perhaps 150 to 200 interceptors get airborne. All that can be spared from other fronts. All that can be fueled with Germany's dwindling petroleum reserves. The German pilots are skilled. Some are aces with dozens of kills. They know the tactics. They've perfected the head-on attack that exploits the B-24's vulnerable nose section. They climb to altitude and position themselves ahead of the bomber stream. Then the Americans arrive. The formation is three-dimensional, bombers stacked in altitude from 20,000 to 28,000 feet, spread across miles of sky. Each bomber bristles with 1050 caliber machine guns. The combined firepower of a 36-ship bomber group creates overlapping fields of fire that turn the surrounding airspace lethal. German fighters make their passes. Some bombers fall. Hidden engines, fuel tanks, or control systems. Parachutes blossom. Aircraft spiral down trailing smoke. But the vast majority of bombers continue flying. They hold formation. They reach their targets and drop their ordnance. And then they turn for home. Still in formation. Still fighting. The German pilots watch them go. They've shot down perhaps 15 bombers. A success by traditional metrics. Except that 15 bombers represents roughly 14 hours of production from Willow Run alone. The Americans will replace today's losses by tomorrow morning. They'll replace this week's losses by next Monday. The mathematics are brutal. A German pilot who survives long enough to achieve 5 kills, ace status, has destroyed approximately 5 hours of American production. If that pilot required 6 months of training, cost substantial resources to equip and maintain, and operates an aircraft that took weeks to build, the exchange ratio is catastrophically unfavorable. Germany is trading irreplaceable assets for replaceable ones. This realization percolates through Luftwaffe command slowly, then all at once. Adolf Galland sees it clearly by September 1944. In a meeting with senior staff, he presents the data dispassionately. German fighter production is approximately 1,000 aircraft per month. Combat losses exceed 800 per month. The gap is widening. Meanwhile, American heavy bomber strength increases weekly despite German defensive efforts. The implication is unavoidable. Continuing the current defensive strategy will bleed the Luftwaffe to death within months. Some officers argue for miracle weapons. The Me-262 jet fighter shows promise. If produced in quantity, it could shift the balance. But Me-262 production is hindered by Allied bombing of factories. And there's the deeper problem. Even if Germany produces 500 jet fighters per month, it doesn't solve the fundamental equation. The Americans will simply absorb the increased losses and continue bombing. They have the production capacity to outlast any attrition Germany can inflict. Back at Willow Run, none of this is visible to the workers on the assembly line. Rose Monroe installs rivets. She doesn't know that bomber number 5247, the aircraft she's currently working on, will fly 32 missions over Germany before being shot down in February 1945. She doesn't know the crew will survive, bailing out over Allied lines. She doesn't think about the strategic implications of production rates or exchange ratios. She thinks about her daughters, about the paycheck, about whether her back will hold up for another 4 hours of riveting. She thinks about the woman working beside her who lost a nephew over Schweinfurt. She thinks about the news reports describing Allied advances across France. She thinks that maybe, if they build enough of these bombers fast enough, the war will end sooner and the killing will stop. But Ford's engineers think about the numbers constantly. They track production metrics daily. They know that Willow Run has now completed more B-24s than all other manufacturers combined. They know the plant has delivered over 6,500 aircraft by September 1944. They project that total production will exceed 8,500 by war's end. They calculate that roughly half of all B-24 Liberators that will ever fly in combat came from a single mile-long building in Michigan. The turning point isn't a single battle or dramatic moment. It's the accumulation of 63-minute intervals repeated thousands of times. It's the moment when German officers stopped dismissing production figures as propaganda and started understanding them as reality. It's the recognition, whether in a quiet interrogation room or in a Luftwaffe planning session, that industrial capacity had become the decisive weapon of the war. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, reviews bombing damage reports in his Berlin office. The reports detail destroyed factories, disrupted rail lines, and cratered refineries. German production is still increasing in some categories despite the bombing, a fact he takes pride in. But even Speer, an architect by training who became an industrial organizer through necessity, can see the trajectory. He drafts a memo to Hitler in October 1944. The memo is carefully worded, avoiding defeatism while presenting facts. Speer notes that Allied air attacks are now sustained and overwhelming, that defensive measures consume resources without stopping the attacks, that American production capacity exceeds Germany's by a factor of 3 to 1 in some categories and 5 to 1 in others. The memo doesn't explicitly state that the war is lost, but the numbers do the talking. Hitler ignores the memo. He talks instead about V-weapons, about new tank designs, about fighting to the last. But Speer knows. The German officers in POW camps know. Even Goering, in his more lucid moments, knows. The war ended at Willow Run. It ended in the decision to mass-produce the B-24. It ended when Ford proved that assembly line techniques could manufacture strategic air power faster than any military force could shoot it down. The bomber stream continues. Every day, every night sometimes. The sound of engines becomes constant over Germany, a drone that never completely fades. Citizens look up and count aircraft. They stop counting when they reach 100 because there are always more. The formations blot out the sun. The contrails crisscross the sky in geometric patterns, and everyone knows, though few speak it aloud, that this cannot be stopped, that you cannot fight an industrial tide, that the war is already over even though the dying continues. Willow Run completes its final B-24 Liberator on June 28, 1945. The war in Europe ended on May 8th. Japan will surrender in August. The last bomber rolls out of the plant to scattered applause from workers who are already being laid off. Total production, 8,685 aircraft in 34 months. The numbers tell a story of industrial achievement unprecedented in human history. From September 1942 to June 1945, Willow Run averaged 255 bombers per month. During peak periods, that figure exceeded 400. The plant operated continuously, 3 shifts per day, 7 days per week. At maximum employment, 42,000 people worked there. They consumed 1.3 million pounds of aluminum per day. They installed 55 miles of wiring into each aircraft. They drove 360,000 rivets per bomber. Every rivet placed by human hands, guided by pneumatic tools. Ford's achievement vindicated mass production principles on a scale that silenced all critics. The B-24s from Willow Run weren't inferior to those built by traditional methods. They were identical in performance and superior in consistency. Accident rates were lower. Maintenance was easier. Pilots preferred them because the standardization meant every aircraft handled the same way. The aviation industry's assumptions about craft production being necessary for quality were proven false. But the cost in human terms was staggering. Of the 18,482 B-24 Liberators built by all manufacturers during the war, approximately 4,700 were lost in combat. Each aircraft carried a crew of 10. That's 47,000 crew positions on bombers that never returned. Not all those men died. Many were captured or evaded. But the casualty rates for heavy bomber crews were among the highest in the American military. A crewman's odds of completing a 25-mission tour without being killed, wounded, or captured were roughly 1 in 4. The 8,685 bombers from Willow Run participated in every major air campaign of the European War. They bombed oil refineries at Ploiești in Romania, losing dozens of aircraft in a single mission but crippling German fuel supplies. They struck ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and Regensburg. They obliterated transportation networks across occupied France before D-Day. They flew missions over Berlin, Bremen, Hamburg, and Munich. They participated in Operation Tidal Wave, Operation Argument, better known as Big Week, and countless tactical support missions during the Ground War. German industrial capacity collapsed under the cumulative weight of these attacks. By late 1944, petroleum production had declined by 90% from peak levels. German fighters sat grounded for lack of fuel. Tank divisions halted because fuel trucks couldn't be refilled. The Wehrmacht's mobility, its primary tactical advantage, evaporated. Ball-bearing production never recovered from the 1943 raids. Aircraft output declined despite Speer's desperate dispersal of factories into caves and forests. The rail network, bombed repeatedly, couldn't move materials efficiently even when factories still operated. The oil campaign proved particularly decisive. In May 1944, before the strategic bombing of petroleum facilities intensified, Germany produced 316,000 tons of aviation fuel. By September 1944, production had fallen to 17,000 tons. By March 1945, it was effectively zero. The Luftwaffe possessed aircraft it couldn't fly. The systematic destruction of synthetic fuel plants, refineries, and storage facilities strangled German military operations more effectively than any ground offensive could have. Albert Speer, interrogated after the war, stated explicitly that the Allied bombing campaign had succeeded, not through terror bombing of cities, which he considered strategically ineffective, but through targeting industrial infrastructure. He cited oil production, transportation networks, and chemical plants as critical vulnerabilities. When asked specifically about American production capacity, Speer acknowledged that Germany had grossly underestimated it. The intelligence failures weren't simply about numbers. German leadership couldn't conceptually grasp the scale of American industrial mobilization. Adolf Galland, who survived the war, wrote in his memoirs that the Luftwaffe lost the battle for air superiority, not through tactical failures but through industrial insufficiency. German pilots were well trained. German aircraft were often technologically superior, but they were overwhelmed by numbers. Galland noted that by 1944, shooting down Allied bombers was statistically irrelevant. We could shoot down 10 and 15 would appear the next day. We could destroy 50 and 60 would replace them. It was like fighting the sea with a sword. The human stories emerging from Willow Run's production line are as varied as the people who worked there. Rose Monroe left the plant when the war ended, returned briefly to Kentucky, then came back to Michigan and eventually started a construction business. She lived until 1997, uncomfortable with her fame as the model for Rosie the Riveter but proud of the work she'd done. She spoke occasionally about those years, always emphasizing that she was simply trying to feed her children, that the heroism people attributed to her felt unearned. Thousands of women who worked at Willow Run faced similar post-war displacement. The jobs that had given them independence and decent wages disappeared as men returned from military service and reclaimed factory positions. Many were pressured to return to domestic roles, some did. Others fought to stay in the workforce, finding positions where they could. The cultural narrative of the 1950s emphasized traditional gender roles, but the women who'd built bombers knew their own capabilities. That knowledge changed them permanently, even when society demanded they forget it. The plant itself faced an uncertain future. Ford tried to convert Willow Run back to automobile production, but the facility was poorly suited for civilian manufacturing. It was too large, too specialized, too far from Detroit's supplier network. The company struggled to find profitable uses for the massive building. Parts of it were leased to other manufacturers. Sections sat empty. The assembly line that had produced a bomber per hour was dismantled. The custom tooling scrapped or sold. In 1953, General Motors purchased Willow Run and converted it to automatic transmission production. The building served various industrial purposes over subsequent decades, but never again achieved the focused intensity of its wartime mission. By the early 2000s, much of the facility was abandoned. Preservationists fought to save portions of the structure, arguing its historical significance. In 2013, a 144,000 square foot section was preserved and converted into a museum. The remaining portions were demolished. The mile-long building that once housed the world's most productive aircraft factory now exists mostly in photographs and memories. The B-24 Liberators themselves had varied post-war fates. Most were scrapped. The military didn't need thousands of heavy bombers in peacetime. Aircraft were flown to remote airfields in the Southwest, stripped of useful components and cut apart. Some found civilian uses, converted to cargo transports or purchased by foreign governments. A handful were preserved in museums. Today, perhaps a dozen airworthy B-24s still exist worldwide. The sound of their engines, that distinctive Pratt and Whitney roar, has become rare. German officers captured during the war continued to grapple with the production numbers even after seeing the evidence firsthand. During the Nuremberg trials, several defendants and witnesses were questioned about industrial planning and wartime production. The testimonies reveal a consistent pattern. German leadership assumed American industrial capacity was overstated, believed their own production was sufficient, and failed to adjust strategy even when evidence contradicted their assumptions. Hermann Göring, testifying in his own defense, was asked about Luftwaffe production and Allied air superiority. He blamed sabotage, fuel shortages, and Allied bombing of German factories. When confronted with comparative production figures, showing American output exceeding German by factors of 3 or 4 to 1, Göring dismissed them as exaggerated. Even facing execution, even after Germany's total defeat, he couldn't fully accept the industrial reality that had doomed his air force. Albert Speer, by contrast, was analytically honest. In his interrogations and later writings, he acknowledged that Germany lost the production war decisively. He described visiting bombed factories and realizing that repairs were temporary, that the Allies would simply bomb them again, that the cycle was unsustainable. Speer calculated that by 1944, Germany was spending more resources defending against bombing and repairing damage than the Allies were spending on conducting the bombing campaign. The exchange ratio had become catastrophically negative. The strategic lessons of Willow Run shaped post-war military thinking. The U.S. Air Force, established as an independent service in 1947, was built on the premise that air power combined with industrial capacity could win wars. The concept of overwhelming an enemy through production, outbuilding their ability to resist, became central to American defense strategy during the Cold War. Nuclear weapons changed the calculations, but the underlying principle remained. American industrial capacity was a strategic weapon as important as any bomber or missile. Ford's assembly line techniques were studied and adapted by industries worldwide. The principles of standardization, modular construction, and continuous process improvement became foundational to modern manufacturing. Toyota's production system, developed in post-war Japan, drew explicitly on Ford's methods, the globalized supply chains of the 21st. Century, where complex products are assembled from components built in dozens of countries, trace their lineage directly to the processes pioneered at Willow Run. The workers who built those 8,685 bombers scattered across America after the war, most didn't talk much about their experiences. It was just a job. They'd done what was necessary. They'd gone to work every day, performed their assigned tasks, collected their paychecks, and gone home. The aggregate effect of those individual actions, the cumulative impact of millions of rivets driven, thousands of sub-assemblies completed, hundreds of bombers rolling out the doors, reshaped the world. But the individual workers rarely saw it that way. They saw the paycheck that bought groceries, the aching muscles after a shift, the satisfaction of a job done correctly. By the 1990s, when historians began seriously documenting the Willow Run story, many of the workers had passed away. Those who remained were elderly, their memories imperfect, their bodies worn by decades of hard labor. But when asked about those years, most expressed pride, not in the abstract notion of winning a war, but in the concrete knowledge that they'd built something real, something that worked, something that mattered. The last B-24 veteran pilot died in 2022. The last Willow Run worker will die soon. The physical building is mostly gone. The aircraft have been scrapped. Within a generation, there will be no living witnesses to what happened in that mile-long factory between 1942 and 1945. Only the numbers will remain. 8,685 bombers, 63-minute production intervals, half of all B-24s ever built. Numbers that German officers couldn't believe, even when confronted with irrefutable evidence. The assembly line changed warfare in ways no general anticipated and no strategist predicted. For thousands of years, war was won by soldiers, their courage, their discipline, their willingness to die for a cause. Later, it was won by tactics, by commanders who could outthink their opponents and position forces advantageously. Later still, technology became decisive. Better weapons, faster ships, more accurate artillery. But in the Second World War, something fundamental shifted. Victory belonged not to the bravest or the cleverest or even to those with the best weapons. It belonged to those who could produce weapons faster than the enemy could destroy them. Willow Run was the embodiment of that shift. Henry Ford didn't design a better bomber, he designed a better way to build bombers. That innovation, unglamorous, industrial, divorced from battlefield heroics, proved more consequential than any tactical brilliance. The B-24 wasn't superior to German aircraft. American pilots weren't necessarily better trained than Luftwaffe veterans. But American factories could replace losses overnight, and German factories couldn't. That asymmetry decided everything. The men who flew those bombers paid in blood. The women who built them paid in exhausted bodies and deferred dreams. The Germans who endured the bombing paid in destroyed cities and shattered lives. The moral weight of those costs doesn't diminish because industrial capacity determined the outcome. If anything, it magnifies the tragedy, that so much suffering flowed from an equation of production rates and resource allocation. But standing in the empty spaces where Willow Run once hummed with purpose, looking at the few preserved sections where bombers took shape 63 minutes apart, there's something else to consider. The assembly line that Ford built didn't just manufacture aircraft. It demonstrated that free labor, properly organized and motivated, could outproduce any system based on coercion. That ordinary people, farmers' daughters from Kentucky, factory workers from Detroit, immigrants seeking better lives, could accomplish extraordinary things when given purpose and decent wages. That democracy, for all its inefficiencies and contradictions, could mobilize resources and coordinate effort on a scale totalitarian systems couldn't match. The German officer sitting in that interrogation room, staring at production figures he couldn't deny, understood something in that moment that transcended military defeat. He understood that his nation had challenged an industrial colossus and lost not through weakness or cowardice, but through a fundamental miscalculation about what kind of power mattered most in modern war. The assembly line had become a weapon, and no army on earth could stand against it. 63 minutes. That's all it took to build a thing that 10 men would fly into battle, that could carry 4 tons of bombs across an ocean, that represented the cutting edge of 1940s aerospace engineering. 63 minutes repeated thousands of times, until the sky over Europe filled with aluminum and rivets and the relentless mathematics of American production. until resistance became futile not because the cause was unjust, though it was, but because the numbers said so. Until even the most dedicated soldiers looked up at bomber formations that blotted out the sun and understood that courage alone couldn't stop what was coming. The factory is mostly gone now. The workers are dying. The bombers have been scrapped. But the lesson remains etched into history in numbers that couldn't be denied. Sometimes wars are won not on battlefields, but in mile-long buildings where ordinary people do extraordinary work, one 63-minute interval at a time.